family and friends of Lee West Movius. We gather now in this virtual way to celebrate Lee's illustrious life, to mourn his death in late June, and in an expression of collective sympathy, to bring now to our minds and hearts Gwen, Diana, James, Rosemary, and others who loved Lee most deeply. I'm Jay Leach, one of the ministers of the Unitarian Universalist community of Charlotte, where Gwen and Lee Movius have been among our most active, engaged, supportive members for many years. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to those of you who are sharing your reflections with us. Thank you to my colleagues, John Herrick and Belinda Parry, for helping to make this service possible. Though the challenges of this time necessitate our separation from one another, the affection and respect we share bridge all distances, weaving our lives together into a compassionate web of concern that extends in these moments from Charlotte to DC to California and to other places around the nation. Lee's death touches each of us in some deep way and leaves our world lessened, deprived of an exemplar of civility and kindness at a time when we so much need these qualities embodied. In the collective sharing of our grief, may there be comfort. Even in loss, we celebrate a remarkable melding of intelligence and kindness, curiosity and conviction, talent and tenacity, seriousness and playfulness, confidence and humility that took shape in the Lee we knew and loved. It is a life deserving of this intentional celebration. Let us pray. O God of all people, though keenly aware of loss in this moment, we are on this day filled with gratitude for the gift of life shared, and especially for the gift of the life we shared with Lee Movius, for all that was endearing, inspiring, exemplary. We give rightful thanks. Today, in remembering, we are grateful. May this service bear worthy witness to Lee's good life. May the grief that is shared among us be tempered by our gathering, even in this way. These things we pray in the name of all that is good and true and beautiful. Amen.
Greetings to you all. I'm Eve Stevens, and alongside Jay Leach, I serve as one of the ministers of this Unitarian Universalist community of Charlotte, Lee's spiritual home for so many years. There was a quiet strength to Lee. In ordinary and difficult circumstances, he met the day with a hopeful spirit, ever leaning into the possibility that the most daunting obstacle can be overcome. Compassionately confident to the last that life is an invitation to wonder and delight. As we honor this life well lived and reflect on Lee's hopeful spirit and quiet strength, it's fitting to share in Emily Dickinson's poem, "Hope is a Thing with Feathers." Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. As a member of this congregation, there's a favorite hymn Lee so often stood to sing with Gwenny, as he called you, Gwen, by his side. And you will be with us still, Lee, every time we sing these words in community. Just as long as I have breath, I must answer yes to life. Though with pain I made my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life.
Hi, I'm Rosemary, Lee's little sister, and I have some memories of Lee I'd like to read to you today. And just as an addendum, I'm sitting here in a garden that I planted this year and dedicating to Lee's memory because of his love of plants. So here are my stories about Lee. We saw an enormous copperhead stretched across the road in Bent Creek yesterday. Ordinarily, I would have called Lee immediately to describe its vivid markings and large size. He would have wanted to know exactly where on the path we stumbled upon it, how fast it was moving, and most importantly, the dog's reaction. He would have peppered me with more questions and details until I would wish I hadn't seen the blasted snake. But Lee is gone, and I cannot tell him anything fun. Lee loves snakes and all sorts of reptiles. As kids, we found exotic creatures in the valley behind our house. Lee showed me the innate coolness and wonder of crayfish, frogs, really anything slimy. Nothing was to be feared, and turtles were prized finds. We dug up juicy, smelly worms for fishing, examining each and choosing only the best, fat, wriggling ones. One day in 1961, Lee found our beagle's puppies in a burrow behind the hedge. Mildred the beagle had the puppies in the garden, and being a bit feral, she carried them one by one and hid them in a den she had dug pretty deep on a muddy slope. Lee got out the spade, opened up the burrow, and handed me each muddy puppy to clean. I was still 5, and Lee was around 14. It was a glorious day. Lee left for St. Mark's that fall, and I became an only child missing her big brother. Lee's homecomings became great causes for celebration. When Lee was home, everything was fun and silly. In spring and summer, the living room windows were always open, and Lee was usually playing the piano, lost in his music. My neighborhood buddies and I threw green apples at him until Mozart turned into the Chopin funeral dirge, and he suddenly leaped up with a great roar and chased us all over the lawn. When Lee got his license, he plopped us on the trunk of our gigantic 1950s Buick and drove up and down Evergreen Lane, slamming on the brakes every now and then to throw us off. He took us to Munster Go Home at the drive-in. We sat on the car roof in our pajamas, and Lee bought us forbidden Cokes and popcorn. My greatest fear in junior high was that Lee would go to Vietnam. He reported to the draft board, and I would like to say that despite enormous bone spurs on his heels, he was deemed ready for combat. But Nixon's lottery saved him. March 18, Lee's birthday, was assigned a high number that year. A few years later, my father died of cancer, and within months, my 2 best friends had also lost a parent to cancer. Lee was visiting on break from law school, and when he saw how sad we were, he grouped us around the piano and got us singing silly, goofy songs he made up. Lee walked me down the aisle when I was married. I thought I'd honestly faint, but he held me tight and whispered silly things in my ear. I could tell you so many stories. Lee was the star of my childhood. He still is my adored brother, and will miss him forever. But whenever I see bears, hawks, or weird creepy crawlers, I smile, and I know he's nearby. I just can't quite see him yet.
Hi, I'm Susie, a longtime friend of Lee's sister Rosemary. I first met Lee when he was home from Harvard for the summer. Rosemary and I had just completed the 6th grade at St. Genevieve of the Pines, an all-girls school run by Catholic nuns. Lee was already a young man of 20, just past his teenage years when we were about to enter ours. He was handsome, worldly, and somewhat exotic to Rosemary's friends. We collectively shared an adolescent crush on him. It was no wonder that the Movius house became our preferred place to hang out. Lee could usually be found intently pored over his piano, filling the house with music. It seemed that no matter how absorbed he was, he always had time for us. It was clear he loved his little sister and was genuinely interested in and amused by her buddies. We eagerly became his entourage. He called us the Moppets and composed the Moppet theme just for us. It was our song, and he would play it every time we came over. He made us feel important, appreciated, and seen for who we were without judgment. Lee was simply the kindest person I had ever met. He was the big brother we all wished we had. Lee was also playful and very, very funny. To our delight, he would slip into what we called the hick from Harvard mode, part hillbilly bumpkin, part sage. In character, he would grin infectiously with his jaw thrust out and pop his eyes out from under knitted brows with devilish merriment. His different colored eyes, one brown, the other green, enhanced the look of being somewhat gleefully off. He honed a nasal southern twang to perfection. Hick speak would become our private language. In character, Lee walked with his feet turned outward, slew-footed as he called it, and would comically get his foot caught in the door, always with that wonderful grin. He made us laugh till our sides hurt. For his birthday one year, we wrote "Happy Birthday to the Hick from Harvard" on his cake and presented him with a hand-painted toilet seat. We thought he was pleased. With Lee, we could just be our awkward, shy, angsty teenage selves. It was okay not to grow up too fast. Life was just more fun when Lee was around. He squired us around town to get burgers and fries and gave us the earnest advice, never forget the commercial establishments of your youth. We never have. One time he took Rosemary and me to a Nashville Tourist game, and what an outing that was, and explained to us the rules of baseball. In the neighborhood park, he taught us how to throw a frisbee with precision and such power that it would sting the hands of the person who caught it. Lee introduced us to his records of folk and bluegrass gospel music and would lead us in sing-alongs to such favorites as "My Dog's Better Than Your Dog," "Family Reunion," and "No School Bus in Heaven." Whenever I came over for dinner, he always made sure I was served the chicken gizzard, a sly gift because gizzards made me gag. After he graduated from Harvard, we renamed him the Grit. And somewhere along the line, we also outgrew our original Moppet status. Because we had probably become very clingy, Lee redubbed us the Limpets. When we played it on the piano, the happy-go-lucky Moppet theme would now occasionally slip into minor key. Maybe to reflect our loss of childhood innocence, we were never sure, but would always end on a happy note. Lee taught us not to take ourselves too seriously. He helped us to laugh at life's absurdity, all the while acknowledging its darkness. He was our port in the storm. In his usual lovely gesture of parting, Lee would simply pat his heart and smile. Back at you, Lee, and thank you. I will never forget you.
May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. I am Hugh Law, a friend from school, college, and afterward. It is my pleasure and privilege to share with you my reminiscences about Lee and perhaps to lay a sprig of laurel on his memory. 59 years ago in Southborough, Massachusetts, we began the third form, or ninth grade, at St. Mark's School. Boarding school was a demanding environment, an intense experience over 4 years with a heavy academic load. Also, they kept us busy with sports, chapel, extracurriculars, study hall, and housekeeping. They allowed us a little time to ourselves on Sunday afternoon. Looking back at Lee, his character and personality are constant from that time through life. Lee had an imperturbable calm and confidence, coupled with a understated sense of humor. We played pranks on each other, but he always got the best of me. He excelled academically at school and at university. Though discerning about human nature, Lee was friendly with all and respected by all. Lee had a particular and personal admixture of unassuming reserve and a warm welcome, which put you at your ease. He had also an unusual ability to focus, which was often displayed on the 9-hole golf course at St. Mark's, as golf reveals character. Lee made his way through the tumult of the late 60s to the University of Chicago Law School, where his brilliant legal career began. As well, Lee had broad interests. He was an accomplished pianist and gardener. I remember well many Sunday evenings seeing Lee play the piano with a big smile on his face in the headmaster's study during what we called, in those far-off days, the sixth form smokers. One evening, several of us snuck into the chapel, and Lee played on the organ, Sweet Georgia Brown and Has Anybody Seen My Gal? He evoked the music of the Calliope in the moment, transporting us from that somber venue to a Mississippi River excursion boat. As well, Lee loved his and Gwen's beautiful garden, whose harmony evokes the gardens of Monet. Its flowering shrubs and bushes, meandering shaded pathways, ferns, and the bridge over the fish pond all reflect care and planning and cultivation over many years. On my last visit, I discussed with Lee his thinking about the future, which then appeared increasingly short and ever more uncertain. Lee, I said, you have a lot of courage. He said, you just have to take it one day at a time. His concern, his focus was always on the other person. His cousin Alice Movius, also a college classmate, reported to our class that how much support Lee had been to her in trips to Massachusetts and otherwise during her own battle with cancer. Samuel Johnson, whom Lee and I studied with relish at Harvard, said this about the death of such a friend. It is a loss which cannot be repaired. The friends which merit or interest may procure us cannot fill the place of old acquaintance with whom the paths of youth may be traced and those impressions revived which gave earliest delight. Lee has left us many delightful memories. Perhaps the closing lines of his report to our college class on the 25th reunion may serve as valedictory. You are all dear to me, and I hope to see you all.
Hello, I'm Raleigh Shoemaker, and I'm honored that Gwen and Diana have asked me to share some remarks about my relationship with Lee through the years, particularly from a law firm perspective. Lee and I first met in 1975 when he came to Charlotte to practice with the legacy Kennedy, Covington, Lobdell, and Hickman law firm, where I had been practicing for a couple of years before he joined us. Lee and I sort of partnered to develop a new area of law for the law firm, a specialization called employee benefit law, but driven in large measure by the passage in 1974 of a new federal law known as ERISA. And over the years, we practiced together, sort of joined at the hip, and it was a great pleasure because Lee was absolutely brilliant. He could analyze these tough laws and regulations and come back and explain it in plain English to a colleague or to a client. And it made him such an asset to the practice as we developed and grew the practice over the years. In addition to being brilliant, he was a wonderful colleague to have. He was kind, he was considerate, he was compassionate, he had not a selfish bone in his body, and had absolutely zero ego about him. So our experience as lawyers together at the firm it was fantastic. I couldn't have asked for more out of a colleague. Now, beyond practicing law as a lawyer, I would like to observe that I feel that Lee was truly a man for all seasons. I hope many of you have had the opportunity over the course of your relationship with Lee to see him perform on the piano. He's truly one of the most wonderful pianists I've ever encountered. He loved sports. I didn't realize for a couple of years what a sports fan he was, but we found out we shared a love for the Boston Red Sox, and that led to a lot of office conversations about sports. And it was a joy and a dimension of Lee that just added so much to our relationship. Food. I couldn't believe it when I found out Lee loved food, and in particular, we discovered a mutual interest in Middle Eastern food. He would find restaurants in Charlotte that made and served Middle Eastern food, and we would meet there monthly or bi-monthly to have lunch together and swap stories about sports and other things. It was a tremendous aspect of our relationship. Nature. I didn't realize, but should have realized, that having grown up in Asheville, he would have been closer to nature than us in Charlotte. And it was so wonderful to see the video that Diana and Gwen posted in April of Lee's walk around their yard here in Charlotte, explaining each of the plants that were growing in the yard. It was just fantastic. Now, I know Lee would indulge me a little bit here when I say I know how proud Lee and Gwen were of their daughter Diana. She grew up with an interest in nature and the environment, and she also had an interest in the arts. She became a very accomplished dancer. One of the highlights of my relationship with Lee and my wife Katie's relationship with Gwen and Lee was to go to Washington in October of 2018 for some pre-wedding festivities for Diana and James. While we were there at the Kennedy Center on the Millennium Stage, there was a world premiere of a ballet that Diana had choreographed, followed by a wonderful family dinner at a Middle Eastern restaurant. Now, I know that many of you have had different kinds of experiences, but we have all been benefited from our relationship with Lee in so many ways. Most of all, he was a teacher. He taught us about law and these other areas, but he also taught me how to live life. He also taught me how to be patient and how to be considerate of others, and most of all, how to exhibit grace when under life's adversities. We will all benefit from his legacy, and it will continue to endure. Thank you for this opportunity.
Hello everyone, I'm Patrick McNeely. I feel very fortunate to have been friends with Lee. I knew Lee from church, the Unitarian Universalist Church here in Charlotte, but actually had known Gwen even more because we served on so many committees together. But once we both retired, I began to know Lee better, especially through our mutual love of books and barbecue. So we went on the B&B tours through Charlotte, going to restaurants and sharing our ideas and our personal book reviews, and always talking about what we were reading and what we were getting out of it. He steered me to writers like José Saramago, wonderful Portuguese novelist, as well as writers from Hungary and Finland, whose names I still have trouble pronouncing. I got him to reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow and other books by that economist, and on that line of thinking, as well as the short stories of Jacob Appel, who he grew to love over the years. But these were only the doorways to an enduring friendship and many wonderful conversations at those restaurants, and of late in the lunch in beautiful Movius gardens behind their home. We did not always agree on everything, but I can say we never had a genuine disagreement about anything either. That's hard to imagine about two retired attorneys who like to take a point and drive it home and make an argument. Lee had been dealing with his cancer and the treatment thereof since 2005, but he would be the very last one to ever bring that up. I never heard him complain over any of those things, except in the mildest of manners, all the way up until his last few days at the hospital. I found that just being around Lee would improve my day. His positivity was contagious. Lee loved the short stories of Jacob Appel, as I said earlier, about which he said, "I especially like short stories that contain an important lesson for leading a successful life." Here are a couple of quotes from Appel, which seem appropriate to end this service with. As Lee's openness to new ideas, quote, "The most dangerous ideas are not those that challenge the status quo. The most dangerous ideas are those so embedded in the status quo, so wrapped in a cloud of inevitability, that we forget that they are ideas at all." And as to his love of books and learning, maybe that is the greatest of wonders, that we can be shaped so much by those we've known closely, and equally by those we've never known at all, and that we too can change the world long after we've left it. I think that can truly be said about Lee Movius. Thank you.
Sir Roger Scruton, the English philosopher and writer, was a prolific author, publishing some 50 books on aesthetics and political philosophy. In On Human Nature, his brief though dense 2017 argument for human uniqueness, Scruton writes, "Culture, both the high culture of art and music, and the wider culture embodied in a moral and religious tradition, sorts ideas by their intrinsic qualities, helps us to feel at home in the world, and to resonate to its personal significance." It's a heady, somewhat intricate thought, one requiring a rather deliberate, intentional reading, hardly comprehensible in this one hearing. I share this observation from Scruton today, not just because it seems to have a certain resonance with Lee Movius's life and outlook, but for a more specific reason. Those were among the final words that voracious reader ever encountered. In the very last of a long series of emails I exchanged with Lee Movius over the years, he wrote this from his hospital bed: "The two books I'm reading here and really enjoying are The Meaning of Belief, Religion from an Atheist Point of View by Tim Crane, and On Human Nature by Roger Scruton. Both," Lee reported, "are relatively short but require concentration, good hospital reading to shut out the medicinal landscape. Will be fun to discuss with you sometime." The message had initiated with a celebration of the recent protests and a commendation for my participation in them. It included his hopes that, quote, "there is some type of cultural shift in the works, and that it will be reflected in November voting, among many other places," end quote. It included mention of a work of fiction by a favored Polish novelist, and concluded with this: "Some very good news is that Gwen tested negative for COVID. We should have Diana's results in the next day or so. My case continues, quite mild. Take care. Lee." And that was Lee Movius. A little email glimpse into his prodigious intellect, still stirring, thinking, exploring, reflecting, even while sequestered in a hospital room. His deep social perspective, still aware of injustice and inequity, still hoping for systemic change. His resolute love and care for his family, concerned much more for them than for himself. His undauntedly optimistic outlook, and his utter refusal to indulge in self-pity. Lee's story begins with parents who were both members of the United States Navy, Dearborn Hannum and George West Movius, he from the Boston area and she a native of Asheville. Married just after the war in 1946, Lee came along a year later, born in Boston, but soon moving back to his mother's hometown, where Lee would grow up in the house they bought in 1949. It was often a very full house, with both his mother's mother and grandmother, along with, for a time, a great aunt and uncle, the latter of whom introduced Lee to a love of baseball through Asheville Tourists games. Lee once shared with me a recording of Samuel Barber's lush composition, Knoxville, Summer of 1915, with its lyrics from a brief prose piece by James Agee. He poignantly explained that Barber's work evoked for him a feeling of the Asheville he knew and loved in the 1950s, a vital, active, bustling place. Something of his heart and soul was shaped there, and a piece of him seemed to have remained in the long and inviting shadows of that valley, looking up to those surrounding cerulean mountains. Perhaps it was he could go home again, because he never found it necessary to sever his ties to that cherished place. He was enrolled at his mother's school, St. Genevieve Gibbons Hall, a celebrated parochial school run by Catholic sisters. His father, a devout Episcopalian, Lee was confirmed in that faith, later admitting he really had no idea why. It was baseball with friends in Compact Grove Park, hiking, camping in the valley behind the house, along with, as you've heard, engagement with all manner of creeping and crawling things, that young boy developing his love of nature. And, as was proper, beginning at age 6, lessons at the piano, first from a renowned local teacher, and then with a different teacher who called forth his remarkably nuanced talent. Music seems to have been for the young Lee a release, an escape from the full house and the not infrequent tension there. His dubiously entrepreneurial father, his groundbreakingly successful realtor mom with her big personality but infrequent attention to nurture, a welcomed, deeply loved sister who'd come along when Lee was almost 9, the elderly relatives, and a beloved cook named Beulah, for whom Lee cared deeply. By the time he'd depart for high school in Massachusetts, so many of the enduring strands of his life were already being woven deeply into Lee. Academics and intellectual pursuit, music, nature and a love of the outdoors, friends, and, as you heard earlier, a playful capacity to find and create fun. Lee developed and retained what one of you called a wide, silly streak, with a surprising mischievousness, something we in this congregation celebrated in Lee's delight-filled engagement in our follies. Watch that charming video of the self-directed garden tour he created in this last spring of his life. And his knowledge of growing things is delivered with wry quips, beauty meeting light-hearted witticisms in a charming portrayal of his winsome personality. It was, to his regret and resentment, not a luxurious flight, but a long train ride that would take him to his father's school, St. Mark's in Southborough, Mass. He was initially miserable and lonely, so far from family, friends, and the familiar mountains that had always meant home. But in time, he'd grow to appreciate, then love that experience. Academically demanding, socially expanding, a place, as you heard, where Lee grew into himself. An exemplary scholar, a young man more inclined to music than sports, the preferred pianist for socials and other occasions, a kind, calm, confident friend, a favorite among the 50 making up his senior class. Accommodating familial social pressure, Lee looked but a couple of dozen miles west down the Massachusetts Turnpike to Harvard, gaining a coveted early admittance before Christmas break of his final year at St. Mark's. Gwen and Diana acknowledged that Lee, so endearingly self-effacing, reserved almost the entirety of any indulgence in snobbery for his Harvard education, a proclivity that fostered a rare tension between father and daughter when Diana recognized early in her time there that she did not wish to continue the family legacy. Lee thrived in that setting, initially pursuing a degree in music before shifting to history, relishing a summer in France at an archaeological dig, honing his skills as a superb writer, developing deepening friendships that would endure for a lifetime in a class that would include his connection to the great composer John Adams, if not also to the likes of Al Gore and Tommy Lee Jones. Headed then to the University of Chicago for graduate studies in modern European history, he gained much more than an advanced education in that august setting. Lonely in his rambling 3-story townhouse, Lee would retreat to a fellow student's apartment, a place not only with company, but with a piano. Gwen, then a medieval history scholar, encountered the handsome, talented Lee, invited him to come back and play, waited with difficult patience until finally, in December of 1970, the sparks of their romance were kindled. Though both of their career goals would shift in that setting, Lee leaving the history program and at a professor's urging entering the law school at the University of Chicago, their romance blossomed there. Avoiding, as you heard, being drafted into the then raging Vietnam War, Lee's concern was more familial, for his father struggling with kidney cancer back in Asheville, to which he'd later succumb while Lee was still a student. He'd complete his law degree in 1973, and then in a June phone call with Gwen, his beloved Gwenny, as he so often called her, he suggested that they get married, and a simple ceremony was planned for the fall. The timing and the venue eventually shifted. They'd cross the country to Gwen's hometown of Berkeley, where on an auspicious day in early January 1974, with snow evident in the Bay Area hills, a congregational minister would marry them in Gwen's parents' home. A quick overnight honeymoon in Sausalito, a 3 days delayed flight out of San Francisco, and the newlyweds arrived in Chapel Hill. There, Gwen would pursue her MBA, while Lee would clerk for Judge Frank Parker on the North Carolina Court of Appeals, then serve as staff attorney for the North Carolina Utilities Commission. To our immense good fortune, in May 1975, First Union Bank enticed Gwen to come to Charlotte. Lee set his sights on the prominent local firm of Kennedy, Covington, Lobdell, and Hickman. In one single day of interviews, as Gwen recalls it, Covington immediately liked Lee. Hickman found his hair too long. He joined the firm in the early summer of 1975, where he'd remain for a long and celebrated career. You heard attestation from a partner there about Lee's practice, an enviable attention to minute detail, with a rare ability to summarize in cogent terms, a keen capacity to parse fine details while raising the discussion to something expansively attentive to fairness, a position in his own burgeoning and complex area of the law, while remaining interested in and accessible to fellow lawyers in other areas. An intensity that made him successful, with a steady and affable calm that made him likable. A man with a mastery in his own practice and a seemingly insatiable curiosity about almost everything else. Gwen and Lee settled into life on Cloister Road, Lee's fecund green thumb emerging there. It welcomed Diana into their lives in 1980, a source from then on of such enduring love and pride for Lee. Then they'd relocate to their beautiful home on Howland Lane, where light and beauty, space for his piano, room to welcome others, and an evolving, exquisite garden made it home for the three of them. Diana recalls with such fond appreciation her dad's wildly exuberant greetings to her friends there, his repeated ruminations about how great his life was and about how beautiful his wife was, his deep interest and engagement in Diana's life and activities, his warm capacity to help her friends feel welcomed, and his habit of slipping her some extra money on the way out the door to make sure she and her friends would enjoy a good meal. Later, on visits back home, Diana took delight in Lee's habit of looking up from the ever-present book in his lap to offhandedly comment as she'd enter and leave the room. So sweet, so sweet. It being Charlotte, a city where religion saturates the culture like humidity. Diana, having abandoned a foray into a friend's church, insisted that Gwen find them a church to attend. Diana knew of the Unitarians and complied, taking Diana to participate in our children's religious education program and hanging out at services while waiting for her. To her surprise, she found herself appreciating what she found, though Lee remained disinterested. An open call for a pianist got Gwen's attention, and again to her surprise, Lee, who was missing music in his life, agreed to accompany the choir in practices and in services. He could not have known then that simple act of volunteering would turn into a regular gig extending 15 years. Lee, ever present at the piano, generously, patiently sharing his prodigious talent with the choir and the congregation under the leadership of both Wally Kluker and Delbrook. And as mentioned earlier, that expanded into a role as the even more patient accompanist for Follies, enduring long, chaotic nights of rehearsals and delighting in the performances that finally emerged from them. He found his way into the larger community through music as well, relishing engagement with the Friends of Music at Queens for long years, and as a part of the community concert board. He was disciplined in his exercise, a masterful swimmer throughout most of his life, a vigorous hiker. Weekends often found him in long stints in the garden, carefully ameliorating the soil, planting new bushes and flowers, tending with self-taught mastery the verdant palette that he had created. A man strangely drawn to prosaic tasks, grocery shopping, running errands, picking up treats and surprises, hanging out in unlikely stores, and indulging impulse purchases, mostly focused on others. It was a decade and a half ago that Lee received his disturbing diagnosis. He navigated the course of treatments and surgeries, a challenge that finally necessitated him abruptly retiring from his then 35-year law practice in 2011. He did so characteristically with grace, proud of his work and confident in his colleagues' capacities to carry on with his clients. Despite the reality of health challenges, Lee enjoyed a vigorous, vital life in retirement, delighting equally in the opportunity to travel and in the simple joys of daily life. Faithful to our congregation, he was unfailing in his presence in the line at the door afterward, often offering generous support and, on occasion, a critique so finely tuned that only in reflection was I aware that Lee had voiced an opposing perspective. I loved Lee, and I told him so. I valued his perspective so deeply, and I miss him now, profoundly. There were highlights in these years, a grand celebration of his 70th birthday among them. None meant more to Lee than Diana's wedding, an event he helped plan, even to the detail of setting up the registry at Bed, Bath, and Beyond. He was effusive in his delight, so enthusiastic in his welcome of James, and so very glad that Diana, whose professional and artistic success he had celebrated, had found a partner for her life. Each visit to D.C. was anticipated with such excitement and reviewed with such appreciation. Where his challenging diagnosis was concerned, Lee said to me more than once, said, no doubt, to others of you with some frequency, I've never understood the inclination to ask, why me? He absolutely refused self-pity, disdained being identified as a patient or as someone needing consolation or commiseration. He approached his treatment as he did the rest of his life, with curiosity, with fascination, and with deep gratitude for those who cared for him. He remarked with frequency that his concern was for Gwen, who, he'd note, had a much more difficult plight than he did. He absolutely adored Gwenny, Bear, and talked openly of his immense good fortune to get to share his life with hers. José Saramago was among the ever-lengthening list of authors Lee loved. It was that Nobel Prize-winning Portuguese writer who once attested, "We all know that each day that dawns is the first for some and will be the last for others, and that for most people, it will be just another day." Perhaps throughout the scope of his engaging life, most certainly in these recent years, one has the distinct sense that for Lee Movius, there dawned few, if any, days that were for him just another day. He loved his life and those with whom he shared it. He marked each day with kindness, compassion, and unrelenting attentiveness. He leaves us all far the better for having known him. Aware of the depth of our loss, we celebrate together on this day the beautiful life of Lee Movius. Long may his memory linger among us, that we may draw upon and be enhanced by his laudable witness.
Though I may speak with bravest fire, and have the gift to all inspire, and have not love, my words are vain, as sounding brass and hopeless gain. Though I may give all I possess, and striving so my love profess, but not begin my love within, the prophet soon turns strangely thin. Come, Spirit, calm our heart's control. Our spirits long to be made whole. Let inward love guide every deed. By this we worship and are freed.
Today is a celebration, not primarily of accomplishments, of which there are many, but of love, of loves, of a man in love with life and those with whom he shared it, and who in so many ways was loved back, both by life itself and by those of you, of us, in his life. Take this love with you, embracing your life and those with whom you share it anew for having participated in this celebration. I'm confident Lee would commend no less for each of us. Let us pray. And now we release the life of Lee West Movius, even as we cling ever more devotedly to his memory and imprint upon our lives. Long may his light shine in our lives, beckoning us to our better selves. Deep may the experience of support and compassion be for Gwen and Diana on this and on other days to come, for showing us the good, the true, and the beautiful. Our thanks, our enduring thanks. Amen.